Hey, it's Alex Williams with the New Stack. Welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about application development, deployment, and management at scale. Dell Technologies is a unique family of businesses that helps organizations and individuals build their digital future and transform how they work, live, and play. The company provides customers with the industry's broadest and most innovative technology and services portfolio, spanning from edge to core to cloud. Learn more at Dell.com. Hi, we're here again at KubeCon plus Cloud Native Con in San Diego, California. Here for an interview to discuss Dell and Project Velero and how it addresses data protection for Kubernetes. And I have three guests: Carlisia Campos, a senior member of the technical staff, VMware, a maintainer on the Velero project, and as I've just learned, a podcast host. So hope we hear a little bit about that. Tom Spoonemore, who's a product line manager for cloud native apps at VMware. Hi, Tom.
Hello.
And Efri Nattel-Shay, who is Director of Product Management at Dell EMC. Nice to have you all here. Thank you for joining us, Efri. I want to just start with understanding a little bit about Project Velero and getting just a baseline understanding of it. Could you explain it for us?
Yes, of course. So Velero is an open source project, and it's a command line tool that runs inside Kubernetes as its own deployment and provides the ability for people to do backups and, of course, restore their backups of their clusters. And we have the ability to also schedule backups or schedule restores. Our CLI tool just provides a very convenient way to manage your backups, not just create and delete, but also see what backups there are, see the logs individually for each backup, see the logs for the server. And so we have a part of Velero is running on a server inside Kubernetes, and another part is a client-side CLI that runs on your own terminal, on your computer. So there are these two parts, and they talk to each other, of course.
Okay.
And so through that CLI interface, you can see your backups, and it just makes it much easier to use than if you were to use KubeControl alone, which KubeControl is a tool that Kubernetes users use to interact with Kubernetes. Basically.
What's the technology architecture underneath that you've developed for Project Velero?
What do you mean?
What is it? Well, tell us about how, what is the actual technology itself? And it does data protection, but what have you built? What is it that you've actually built?
Well, Velero was built using the Go programming language, and we use there's a Go client SDK that was developed to interface with the Kubernetes APIs. So we use that SDK, and mainly we have a bunch of functionality on top of that. And one thing that is very handy for Velero users is that we have a system of syncing. So once you create a backup, we are continuously syncing, or if you delete a backup, we are continuously syncing all your backups. So whenever you want to restore, your backups will be up to date. And also, we provide a system of describing the backups, and on the fly, you can get status updates. If you just do like Velero describe a backup, you will see what is going on with your backup down to details.
So that syncing capability is really key to that.
It is.
And Go is such a fixture and in the Kubernetes and cloud native community.
Yes.
That makes sense then to build upon it.
And especially at the beginning, now Kubernetes has more SDKs. At the Go SDK was the first one, which makes sense because Kubernetes was also made with Go.
Right.
And so it was more robust when Velero started back, I don't know, a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So who is in this community? Who are you seeing show up to help contribute? And we were talking beforehand, and you have how many stars now? Get it like 3,000 or something?
3,300 something stars.
Wow.
Yes, it's a very popular project, and amongst any other the backup capabilities projects, I think Velero is definitely the most popular, if not one of the most popular. The interesting question for me, though, is who is not in this community?
No.
Yes, because if you go around asking Kubernetes users, I mean, a lot of people are not using Kubernetes. We are in a journey, right? We are looking into what this is and learning and implementing it. But if you start talking about with Kubernetes users, a lot of people are not doing backups. It's just not something that they got to yet. And I find it very interesting because in my mind, it's a very good strategy to start with adding backup capability into your strategy, because then you can delete things and bring things up more easily, and just like having that safety of having a backup there. And also when you start thinking about restoring things, you start thinking, well, if I'm rushed, I don't want to necessarily restore everything I have in my cluster or in my clusters. How can I segregate things? And once you start thinking, how do I want to separate things maybe into namespaces to then be able to have a quick restore, then you might also think, well, let me create those namespaces in that manner to begin with, you see? Mm-hmm. So, but to answer your question, we have a lot of developers now. I think developers are more, maybe the developer community feels more equipped to go in and use a CLI tool, and that's, and make changes, even make contributions. At least that's what I see.
So Tom, when you think about Project Velero, what are the use cases that come up? And just one of the observations that that I like to make, just based upon what you're saying, the syncing capability seems to be key here, and it reminds me of syncing capabilities that we see in just the everyday applications that we use. But now we're thinking about syncing it, on the clusters, right? So you don't have to worry about it. Essentially, it takes away a concern to some extent, doesn't it?
Yeah. So when we talk about Velero, we talk about a backup, restore, and migrate, right? So Carlisia spoke to backup and restore, right? So the ability for us to do backups, and Kubernetes, I think generally is kind of has in the past had a reputation of being where you run your stateless workloads. But the truth of the matter is there's more and more stateful workloads that are being run in Kubernetes clusters. And it's those workloads that are going to be storing state in either the etcd database itself or in persistent volumes. Mm-hmm. And so Velero is specifically coded to handle those use cases, right? So it's not only backing up all the pods, all the objects that are in your Kubernetes cluster, but also the underlying data in your persistent volumes. So we see kind of a maturing of the community where customers are starting to run their stateful workloads inside of their clusters, and because of that, needing to address this data protection element that really all of operations has been focused on for so many years in traditional infrastructure, right? So we see backup and restore as being a major component. But we're also saying that customers don't want to necessarily be locked into a particular platform, right? Don't want to be locked into a particular cloud provider. And so they use Velero to be able to do migrations between clusters. Oh. So they'll be migrating from perhaps one cloud provider into another cloud provider. Or frankly, even if they don't want to perhaps go through the complexity of doing a Kubernetes upgrade, they prefer rather to just create another cluster.
Does it take a snapshot of it, or does it?
We use the term snapshotting to refer to how we handle the underlying persistent volumes and how we handle persistent volumes. So yes, in that regard, it does. So the idea of the use case where we're doing an upgrade is you build another cluster, install Velero on it. As Carlisia pointed out, you pointed at the same where the backup was taken from the original cluster. It syncs those backups down. Now you can do a restore. So you restore the the cluster state, and effectively you have a completely working cluster on the new version of Kubernetes. Now you can move to delete the old cluster.
Yeah.
And it's because of this kind of pattern that we're starting to see more and more companies and more developers looking at their clusters as more of ephemeral resources versus resources that are long-lived.
Because they can go away.
Right, exactly.
And one question that we get a lot is what happens if my cluster goes down, the cluster where I'm keeping my backups. You don't have to have your backups stored in the same provider where your cluster is. So ideally, your backup will be on-prem or in a different provider, different from where the cluster that you're backing up. So that risk wouldn't be there.
So Efri, how are you using this capability in PowerProtect software?
Yeah, so let me start with a little bit about what PowerProtect is.
Yes.
PowerProtect is our new stack of protecting modern workloads, whether it's an integrated appliance or a software stack or coming up a SaaS platform to do this backup. And we basically take all of the data protection use cases, backup, disaster recovery, cyber recovery, and we pack them into a single stack so that the IT operators, our customers today, can use that same stack for all of the data protection use cases. One of the things we identified is that more customers are starting to move to Kubernetes. And they have Kubernetes environment, and like Tom said, things started to have state, and applications started to have state and move into Kubernetes. And then the question became, how do I protect this data? And we had a number of discussions with customers where the developers want to start shipping applications into the production environment, and the IT operations people say, if this application has data and I cannot keep this data backed up, and I cannot have audit control for that, and I cannot have governance for that, and I'm not ready to move this into my production environment. So what we came up with inside PowerProtect is the ability to protect both VMs and applications and containers from the same environment. And we're leveraging Velero by the way that Velero knows very well how to back up the Kubernetes resources. They've done an excellent job of crawling the Kubernetes cluster and understanding what needs to be backed up and what doesn't. So we take the knowledge from Velero. We are using Velero to take this data, this metadata about the cluster, and we are using snapshots at the storage level, and we take the data and the metadata and we keep this in a secondary storage, namely data domain, which has great deduplication ratios and has ability to replicate the data to an external site. So with that, we have one central repository that contains both the data and information about the cluster.
How does this differ from more traditional data recovery, data migration, data protection technologies? What's the differentiator in terms of how you view it, in terms of how you've seen other technologies developed in the past?
Sure. I think Tom would be a much better person to answer that. But the way I view it is that if you are using a database, or if you're using a provider, a cloud service provider, those systems will have their own backup mechanism. But the difference with Velero is that we back up we're not thinking about systems separately. We can back up the entire cluster as a unit. In the case of Velero, you have an additional advantage, which is we give the ability to back up selectively. So let's say, for example, you can break things down into namespaces, or you can break things down into you can have labels that you determine, I just want to select these things to back up. We recommend you have at least one frequent backup of everything, but the beauty of it is that you can selectively restore. Because if you have a big cluster, it will take a long time to restore everything, and maybe you don't need to. Maybe it was one namespace that was deleted, so you say, I'll just select that namespace and restore it. Or migrate it. I just want to migrate the development environment, the development namespace, into a different cluster. So, and I'm going to then remap that namespace name, which we have this ability too. I'm going to rename it staging, so my QA team can use it. but it's a mirror. An identical environment. And another thing too is that when you are using Kubernetes on a service provider, you don't have access to the SCD to make a backup. And that is a bit beyond your question, but comparing just a normal backup tool with Velero, because Velero access etcd through the Kubernetes API, we can do basically anything with the data from the cluster. With a service provider, for example, as I was saying, you wouldn't have access to etcd to make a backup of it. We can do basically anything with the data from the cluster. With a service provider. So since we can access a service provider Kubernetes cluster, because Velero accesses it through the API, we can back up your entire etcd database.
Wow. I have not heard that before, and how etcd, is used in that way. How did that come about? I mean, what were you thinking about? I mean, it seems like that is a real, interesting capability. When we first heard about it, etcd, it was several years ago, and it was clear that it was a cornerstone of Kubernetes, right? In providing that, that polling mechanism, right? Mm-hmm. And so through that polling mechanism, then the backup technology then fits with that. And so then when it's polling it can take snapshots of the different internal
with etcd, that's where all the objects are stored in Kubernetes, right? And so, because the way Kubernetes runs is based on a declared state of a number of objects that have been declared into the system, etcd is keeping that current state, right? So what's unique about Velero's approach, just to emphasize what Carlisia is saying, is that as kind of compared to like traditional backup where you're doing a file system pass or you're backing up underlying volumes, that's not always possible with Kubernetes. And so Velero takes a very unique approach in using the Discovery API to really discover all of the objects that are inside of etcd, and then back up the ones that are being selected as part of that backup, right? So if it's a particular namespace or if it's the entire cluster. So it's grabbing all those cluster objects, grabbing their state, and then if there are persistent volumes that are associated with any pod objects that are in there, to automatically snapshot those and to package all of that up.
Yeah.
So it's really restoring is a matter of just like reconstituting etcd.
Yeah. And so the etcd is separate from any volume, persistent volume. So the way Velero deals with the persistent volume is through, let's say, your persistent volume sits on Amazon AWS. We use the Amazon API to trigger snapshots and then say, okay, I want a backup of this persistent volume. And then there is some connection with persistent volume and persistent volume claim that we need to know, but Kubernetes knows what persistent volume is hooked up to which persistent volume claim. But in any case, we use the Amazon API, in this case, the service provider API, to trigger and manage the snapshot. And we have a system of plugins that you can write a plugin to interact with the API of any system provider to manage that persistent volume backup.
This gets into multi-cloud issues, but Efri, I was going to ask you about this, like with the PowerProtect software, then are all these capabilities offered then with the software itself? Is it essentially built upon Velero?
So we're taking Velero, we're taking the essence of backing up the metadata. We're not necessarily using everything that Velero offers today. We are leveraging the fact that Velero uses the Kubernetes APIs, so it has a very large interop. We don't need to comply with a specific Kubernetes distribution or a specific storage vendor. As a backup software, we want to be able to provide protection for our customers or whatever they're using, whatever kind of environment that they're using. Right now, we're focusing on on-prem. We see that most of our customers today, they're center of gravitation is the on-prem. And we were surprised, to be honest. We thought ourselves initially that Kubernetes means public cloud. Not at all. Everybody, especially the large customers, they have a very large on-prem footprint. Most of them have on-prem and cloud. So what we're looking into next year is extending the solution using the same stack. It's technically possible to do that. It's more of a question of qualification, latency, and things like that, but enable the same stack to run both on-prem and in the cloud. And that also plays with tons of mission control. So we can take the same Velero distribution, the same PowerProtect software, and run it here or there and provide a seamless integration between the two.
Maybe we can then talk about Tanzu mission control, and I don't want to mean to interrupt it either. Though.
No, I was just gonna underscore what Efri was saying. In fact, it's the extensibility of Velero that allows for solutions like PowerProtect to come in and write plugins to have that interact with the PowerProtect backup appliance and software, so that Velero can back up these objects and then pass the snapshotting, the data snapshotting off to a system like PowerProtect. So it's the way that Velero is designed is really quite nice and elegant in that way.
So these plugins are getting built inside the Velero community, inside the project?
Yes. So up to recently, we had the Velero maintainers ourselves. We maintained plugins for AWS, Google Cloud Platform, in Azure. Well, we still do, but until recently, they were right inside the Velero core. And we just removed, with version 1.2, we just removed them into their own repo. Just to make it, for so many reasons. One is to make it easier for people to, if they want to, or we want to make changes to those plugins, we don't have to touch the Velero core, and they can be updated independently. They don't have to wait for a Velero release to be, whatever update to be made available to the user. Now, so we have these 3 plugins that we maintain, and we have many plugins that the community has developed.
Okay.
So we have DigitalOcean plugin, Stack Points, right? Portworx. And we have a sample plugin repository, an example plugin repository that people can look up and see if they want to develop a plugin for whatever service provider. Let's say it might be the service provider themselves, or maybe someone who wants to have that plugin for a service provider that they're using, they might just develop it. And we have documentation too.
Yeah, so the fact that Velero has so many extensibility options is very helpful to us. We can write a plugin to write to data domain, to the secondary storage. We can write a plugin that has a creation of application consistent backups for MySQL, for other applications out there. So the fact that it's a framework that allows us to do so many things is very beneficial to us.
Yeah, and you mentioned Tanzu Mission Control, which is a part of our Tanzu portfolio, so which is a build, run, and manage strategy. Mission Control is part of that management framework. Tanzu Mission Control is being developed to help customers manage across a fleet of Kubernetes clusters, right? I mean, at one time people had their 1 or 2 clusters, but as operations takes on being really an internal service provider, they're going to have fleets of clusters that they need to manage across, both from the lifecycle management of clusters to doing security and compliance across clusters and data protection. So again, because of the extensibility of Velero, we have the ability to bring Velero into Tanzu Mission Control to provide that data protection capability. This will allow customers to easily install Velero data protection on their clusters, literally a click of a button. We automatically install Velero for them, manage the lifecycle of Velero on the cluster, allow them to centrally create policies for doing backups, scheduling backups, performing restores, and doing migrations from one cluster to another. We will be enabling this for both the platform operator, as well as the DevOps or application operators, and the developers themselves who want to clone perhaps a namespace from one environment to another.
And the fact that Velero works in a finer granularity of the namespace is also very helpful, because we see from the DevOps and the application admins, they want to be able to label a specific namespace, a specific application, and say this needs to have a gold policy. Another application, another namespace needs to have a silver policy, which means less frequent backups, maybe do not replicate the backup to another place. So working in the finer granularity allows the right people to define the right policies and finer control and saving money on copying just what you need when you need it.
I think just in conclusion, I'd like to ask about the roadmap ahead. And one of the things you did mention is how you separated the plugins from the core. What will be the continued work on the core that you'll be building out over the next several months, and how does that then fit with the use cases and the product itself? And I guess we can start with you and go from there.
Yeah, so just quickly, we just had a 1.2 release just before KubeCon, and we're having KubeCon, and then in the US, we are in the US, the core maintainers. We have Thanksgiving, and we're going to get together and decide what's going to come down the pipeline. Mm-hmm. We do have, everything is open, our backlog, and we have community meetings every Tuesday, and we welcome people to come and help us decide what our upcoming features should be. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of ideas, a lot of open issues that we need to tackle.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say from the perspective of Velero and mission control, the ability to do delegation, like I kind of described a moment ago, where our cluster admin can delegate backups to to developers, specify what objects they're allowed to back up, where they're allowed to restore them, this kind of thing. And features like that really help for fleet management.
Efri?
Yeah, for PowerProtect, I think the main task ahead is the tighter integration with tons of mission control. We're working to have tons of mission control integration with PowerProtect so that on-prem and then multi-cloud backups would be doable using the combination of tons of mission control, Velero, and PowerProtect.
Well, thank you all very much for your time today to discuss Project Velero and PowerProtect software, the use cases for Velero, the work in the community and the success there. And maybe we can just end with a little plug for your podcast. What is the podcast you just started?
Absolutely. Well, let me say that the Velero website is velero.io.
Okay.
All the information that we mentioned will be there, where to find us, where to find our meetings. Yes, we just launched a podcast called The Podlets. The Podlets. So it's The Podlets on Twitter. ThePodlets.io is the website. And we talk about cloud native concepts and distributed systems, and how we try to make sense of what everybody's talking, not everybody, but what a lot of people are talking about, to help people just understand, join in, and maybe even embrace these new technologies that we are benefiting from. We have always been beginners and newcomers, so we're trying to help onboard people if they want to.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Make it easier.
I just listened to my first episode yesterday.
Great. Well, wonderful.
That's awesome.
Well, thank you very much, and have a great KubeCon, and look forward to talking again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Dell Technologies is a unique family of businesses that helps organizations and individuals build their digital future and transform how they work, live, and play. The company provides customers with the industry's broadest and most innovative technology and services portfolio, spanning from edge to core to cloud. Learn more at Dell.com. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.